Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening, a part of England where we've often worked and really enjoyed it. What's new is this location, which is truly remarkable. We were here for the first time 2 weeks ago, and this is our second visit. And it's a tremendous institution, really wonderful building. Our main purpose, as a rule, to come to the Mass Observation Archive has been to look at the collection of diaries, some 500 of them, a few of which we've edited, and the bibliography that's given to you here includes some of those, plus a lot of others that other people have done from the archive, and some non-MO diaries as well that were written during the Second War. Let me just start by saying a few words about the variations in MO's diaries, because they really are quite impressive. A few diaries are really long, and Nella Last probably stands out in this respect. Maybe 10 million words. Nobody actually knows for sure, because I don't believe anybody's ever read it from beginning to end. It is so huge. Maybe the second longest would be Naomi Mitchison's, because it's certainly a very substantial piece of work. By contrast, some diaries are very short, and most probably would be considered relatively short. While a few continued for maybe 4 or 5 years, many failed to last a year, because keeping a diary in an assiduous way is a difficult task, particularly if you're in the middle of a war. So a lot of people who started strongly gave up, often for good reasons, after a few months. A few diaries include passages of detailed description and reporting, but many are brief and unexpansive. Some focus largely on public affairs and commented mainly on the news of the day, especially news about the war. But others took pains to write about more personal matters: home, family, friends, work, leisure, travel, personal well-being, or its absence. Other matters of immediate concern to the diarist. Most writers adopted a fairly matter-of-fact stance. Others were, at least from time to time, self-disclosing and prepared to reveal their feelings, even painful ones, and they sometimes come out of the blue unexpectedly. Some diarists wrote daily, without exception. More commonly, though, there are gaps in a diary, many of them just for 2 or 3 days, but a few very much longer. The MO diaries that have been published so far were almost all composed by people who liked to write, and who by any reasonable standards would be considered good writers. And some were also, or had been, assiduous letter writers. Many diarists also answered MO's more or less monthly questionnaires known as directives, and these answers often usefully supplement the material that is in the diaries for publication. Well, these are a few introductory remarks, and Patricia will now speak about what she considers some of the most important features of 20th century and especially MO diary writing, and some of the challenges in editing this writing. And I shall follow with a few further reflections on diaries and the roles of their editors.
Well, let me begin by echoing Bob's appreciation of this impressive new archive. And Jessica gave us a wonderful behind-the-scenes tour today, so we are even more impressed than we were the first time that we were here. And it's certainly an attractive and definitely research-friendly environment. So over the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about modern diaries and their key characteristics. Then I'll examine some of the challenges in dealing with these sources. How are they especially valuable, and what perhaps may be their limitations? I'll explore 5 themes. The first, the diversity of modern diaries. Modern diaries, that is, diaries written since the early 20th century, naturally share attributes with those of earlier ages. They're at times confessional or self-justifying, perhaps a repository for scandalous secrets, but sometimes little more than a list of chores, appointments, expenditures, and weather events. But they differ from past diaries in several ways. First, they've been written by a much broader segment of society. Increased literacy and universal primary education, in particular the education of women, made a huge difference, as did, in the 20th century, a little more leisure, somewhat more privacy, a modicum of flexibility in limited budgets. Someone like Nella Last had to purchase paper for her writing by the ream, to give some sense, and increased female employment, and the spread of free public libraries. Indeed, some of the very best modern diaries are by women, many of whom were the first generation to write easily and well, to have the social freedom, the breadth of experience, to give literary voice to their opinions. The Canadian author Alice Munro, now a Nobel laureate, as you may know, and now about 80 years old, observed to a fellow female author who had similar pioneering farm roots that none of their ancestors would have enjoyed the leisure to write, whatever their potential. As Bob mentioned, Mass Observation's splendid collection is of close to 500 diaries by men and women. But the important point here is that the majority were far from the public eye or the literary scene. Naomi Mitchison, whose diary Dorothy Sheridan has edited and published, is a rare exception. Well, both sexes were aware that they were living through momentous times when, in August 1939, Mass Observation invited volunteers to keep diaries. Bob and I have had the privilege of going through much of the collection, and there are gems in almost all of this writing. But on the whole, women were the better diarists. Why? Many of you have used the collection and may have some thoughts, but here are a couple of things to consider. Women evince sensitivity to, in general, a broader range of issues. They're much more likely to be emotionally sensitive and empathetic, and many more of them than men had a real ear for dialogue, which comes through in a lot of the diaries. From the male perspective, some men wrote, and only could write, for a short time, because after all, many were called up for military service or other war work that left little time for reflection and writing. Others tended to report mostly war news, itself, of course, highly censored. Still others may have had work that gave them scant chance for broadly based social interaction. I was reading today one diary of a man who worked for the Forestry Commission. He spent most of his days cutting down trees and not observing what people had to say in ration queues. The two exceptions we know of and have published were both men with a zeal for social observation and a really focused dedication to it. They really did see themselves as mass observers. One, Dennis Argent, was already a journalist, and the other, Leonard Adamson, was a businessman, a man who aspired to journalism. Both were astute observers. And Dennis was, as he told us on the one occasion we were able to meet him, that he liked to be on the outside looking about him. That was how he saw himself. Leonard, a fine reporter of his ARP work and quite analytical and often critical of the work of others in that field, reveals very little that was personal. Indeed, though married, he rarely mentions his wife, and he never names her. None of the men whose diaries we've examined ever really writes his diary as to a friend or a confidant. But many women did. It's hard to imagine the massive diary of Nella Last was other than her best and perhaps only close friend, given in particular her husband's deficiencies as a companion. Having edited 3 volumes of Nella's work, there were times when she was our closest friend, too. Many of Emo's diarists were women on their own. Some were part of that cadre from whom one war had already taken potential marriage partners. Others had partners and sons currently serving, missing, or presumed dead. With the men gone and much work needing to be done, women found new tasks, embraced broader social roles, and experienced a much altered world. And they wrote about them. Their experiences were novel, and that perhaps gives part of the flavor to these diaries. All kinds of things might crop up. Driving a mobile canteen through a bombed-out city. Of course, coping with rationing. Helping house and feed refugees or evacuees. Giving parties to cheer up small children or lonely British and Allied soldiers at Christmas. And learning to drive for the first time. There are quite a number of the diarists who started to drive by learning to drive a large van, a canteen. And they were, many of them, of course, from households that didn't have a car in any case. As such experience could stimulate lively, engaging writing, sometimes rooted in increased personal self-confidence and autonomy. Understandably, diarists who began writing their crisis or war diaries with an outward purpose in mind often turned to their writing as a friend, an antidote to loneliness, a place to record their deepest thoughts. As Dadi Penna, who self-evacuated with her 2 children to Cornwall in September 1939, put it, quote, "I'm trying to settle myself down as philosophically as possible to a totally strange existence, consoled entirely by my writing and MO activities." Some of the best diaries were written, and this is not really surprising, by people who saw themselves as writers, as Bob mentioned. They liked to write and, however done, could set aside time to write. And Bob's going to have a bit more to say on this later. Dadi Penna, whose home was in Surrey, identified her wartime commitments as writing, art, and domestic. Naomi Mitchison, as I've mentioned, was a well-established writer, and Gladys Langford, an unhappy teacher, desperately wanted to get published, but was turned down. And in fact, she's one of the only diarists I think we've found who explicitly said she wanted her diary to be published. The prolific Nella Last, who, as Bob mentioned, penned at least 10 million words over 26 years, was also an inveterate letter writer who would have liked to have published books, although she published nothing in her lifetime. She once said, "Words have always fascinated me." My second point, the ways in which diaries give a better feel for nuanced social realities. Early in her writing, Nella Last records how she detested conscientious objectors, widely known as conchies, a view that was shared by most of her fellow volunteers in the WVS canteen in Barrow-in-Furness. Some of the women wouldn't serve them at all, and Nella refused to serve them any hot food, and she was not displeased to see them shunned by enlisted seamen. Gradually, though, her view softened as she saw the same group of conchies and observed their heavy, often smelly work at the docks. While not agreeing at all with their refusal to bear arms, after all, one of her sons was an enlisted soldier, gradually she came to see them as her conchies. And after learning of one man's accidental death, was grateful that a few days before she'd bent a little and served him a hot meal. The ultra-detailed 1941-42 diary of Private Dennis Argent was written by an actual Conchi. And in it, one observes the remarkable range of attitudes and personalities displayed by Conchis, as well as their willingness to take great risks by, as Dennis did, joining bomb disposal units or acting as unarmed battlefield medics. Here again, we're able to observe closely how attitudes change. For Dennis himself, a bookish, free-thinking left-winger, gradually came to doubt some of his earlier convictions, and he eventually signed up for combat duty. In many other diaries, we can see how the near reverence for Churchill as war leader was often linked to a determination that he should not be the leader of post-war Britain. Diaries from this period document sometimes confused and contradictory attitudes towards race, as many writers encountered people of color, American soldiers, or medical staff from the Caribbean for perhaps the first time. And more provokingly, first glimpses of mixed-race children sometimes evoked a reaction even among those who saw themselves as open-minded. Indeed, mid-20th century diaries are a wonderful source for exploring the many ways in which the Britain of over half a century ago is very different from today. A particular strength of manuscript diaries is that they often convey a raw sense of social reality, be it casual expressions of brutal anti-Semitism, very common at the time, or personal yearning for a visit from a lover, or confessing to an abortion that no one else knew about. It was still, after all, a criminal offense. Thirdly, diaries are particularly good at capturing the moment. They're remarkably good at recording slices of life that might otherwise be lost forever. The Dewsbury, Yorkshire shop assistant, Kathleen Hay, writes about her struggling, very poor working-class customers, their day-to-day anxieties, their turns of phrase, their muddles over complicated rationing, their indignation at government authorities, and their horror that cigarettes were proving hard to get. She also describes the action of their children, who in this age of social media, we think of things as being absolutely instantaneous. Well, it did appear that the children in this working-class area were very quick to report any sign that deliveries were being made to the corner shop, especially if they thought the deliveries might include sweets. Mums and grandmothers in this community, brought up far from a nanny and from nursery food, were disgusted at the removal of the sweet ration for infants under 6 months. From other diaries, we learn that it was not uncommon for women to be propositioned or pawed in the cinema. The cinema was, after all, perhaps the largest recreational activity. Dancing might have come close, but anyway, one 30-year-old unmarried diarist, Marjorie Davis, wrote on Friday, the 20th September, 1940, quote, "I went to the pictures tonight and had an adventure. So I'm afraid I only know half of what was in the picture. I was picked up by the young man next to me. A very earnest pickup, too, including a proposal of marriage. I have promised, after much persuasion, to go to the pictures with him Monday, but I don't know if I shall go. It struck me he might be a handful," unquote. Diaries also give a person-on-the-spot view of what it was like to be bombed and the range of practical and personal implications of wartime hardship, even when the damage was not catastrophic. Phyllis Walther in Dorset discusses movingly the seismic shift that came for larger and better off households, with the loss of servants, which forced women in large houses to learn new domestic skills, as well as managing the rationing schemes, sometimes storing emergency goods to meet possibilities of others being bombed out. They, after all, had attics and spare rooms in which they could store these things. They had to eat less, and they had to give up having a car to drive. Phyllis herself learned beekeeping is another one of her coping strategies. Diarists were also often spectators with front row seats. Kathleen Tipper, a young woman who traveled daily from South London to her work near the Embankment, reveals the co-joined horror and ordinariness that made up many a Londoner's day in wartime. A single day's record included an early morning raid, quite a severe one, she said, and also a visit to the cinema to see an Orson Welles spy thriller, and, in the evening, listening to a play on the wireless, which she judged to be quite the most sinister play I've heard for ages. As though reality in Blitz London was not threatening enough. My fourth point, a few remarks about working with diaries. Diaries, by their very nature, are very subjective, subjectively driven. They're distinctively shaped by the personality and quirks of each writer. This subjectivity does mean that in at least one major respect, diaries have to be handled with caution, for they're a fragile basis for most generalizations. They don't adapt well to the methodology of the social sciences. While an individual's perspective may be engaging, written with verb, it's not likely representative, whatever that word means. To read a fine diary is to enter into reality through the eyes of just one individual. That person may be thoughtful and perceptive, but she remains just one person, concerned as a rule with her own particular experiences. The sensitive diarist stands apart, just as a character in fiction might, like Thomas Hardy's Tess of the Dubervilles, perhaps. However, sometimes there are times when an individual diarist may speak for others. I offer three examples. A London diarist, Olivia Cockett, in September 1940, described in detail the cellar in which she and 8 others had taken shelter during the first terrifying days of the Blitz. She cast her eyes around the makeshift sleeping quarters and tried to portray the feelings, the resilience, or lack of resilience, of each person there and how well or badly each was coping. Anyone reading her account would, I think, find it a plausible portrayal of what life must have been like during those extraordinary days in the world's then largest city, as everyday realities were being ripped apart. My second example is also very much of its time. Private Dennis Argent, who I've mentioned, was a member of the bomb disposal unit in Luton. Once in late 1941, he described in detail what he called a typical soldier's evening, wandering through the blacked-out town, searching for and flirting with girls, mainly young factory workers, universally known by the soldiers as tarts, all accompanied with much swearing and bragging. Again, the diarist captures a mood and a masculine milieu that must have been commonplace in the early 1940s, including the crass misogyny that was central to so many men's identity. Third, I draw on that extraordinary diarist Nella Last again. On the 26th of March 1940, she watched the launch of an aircraft carrier in the giant shipyard in Barrow-in-Furness. Her account has cinematic qualities. one can almost hear the excited buzz of the crowd, feel the festive atmosphere, and realize that in this brief moment, virtually all members of the Barrow community, workers and capitalists, men and women, were united in glowing satisfaction as the new ship, which many of them have played some role in constructing, slipped into the water. Fifth, I'll conclude with comments about dealing with living diarists or their immediate heirs, and, as these people die, the tools that researchers must now make use of. A few MO diarists are still alive, or were until recently, and gaining their cooperation or that of their family has been essential. Essential to MO's need for proof that anonymity can be dispensed with, and invaluable for enhancing any published edition. This research requires more than scholarly acumen. Tact, diplomacy, empathy, and careful listening are among the skills that may be called upon. But the rewards can be substantial, both personally and professionally. Using real identities ensures historical authenticity and opens doors to adding new material, photographs, family trees, local history and identities, and sometimes other writing by the diarist. Phyllis Walther's two sons spent a day driving us around parts of rural Dorset that are mentioned in her diary and helped us to gain access to the family's former home. Through Dennis Argent's daughter and son-in-law, we met the then frail Dennis, his wife, who was his wartime girlfriend, and with whom he had major political differences at that time. And we were allowed to publish several family photographs. Kathleen Tipper, whom I've mentioned, we located from electoral rolls, living in 2004, just a few blocks from her wartime address. And she generously, if initially a bit skeptically, agreed to support the publication of her wartime diary under her own name. Once on board, she and her sister shared their family's history, provided background on their world before the war, described their post-war conditions of life, up to and including how Kathleen, whose identity had always been tied up with her Woolwich history, had attended a 2005 Buckingham Palace luncheon as a representative of the home front, 60 years after the war in which she'd lived. This collaboration certainly helped to make a better book. We still sometimes share a meal with Kathleen, now 95, and her sister, and exchange seasonal greetings. Her cards always come from a charity supporting one of the past empire's bravest soldiers, the Gurkhas. Kathleen, one of MO's youngest wartime diarists, is, of course, part of a passing era, as even are the children of these diarists. Nella Last's sons were both deceased well before we came to edit her post-war writing, while her grandsons were most helpful, and one of them is now dead. There was much they did not know. Now researchers must turn to more modern tools to establish a life history. Finding Kathleen 10 years ago by means of electoral rolls seemed novel enough to me, and Bob and I both schlepped heavy volumes in the now-defunct Family Records Center to try to determine when a diarist might have married, had children, died, and the like. Now most of this work can be carried out, as most of you know, electronically, and can be done from one's kitchen table by a person with the right skills. We still pursue traditional methods, field work and work regarding probate wills, for instance. But in our three most recent projects, we've relied on a skilled genealogist who graciously volunteers her time while we pay her for the documents that she orders. This work has been important for two reasons. First, we were able to demonstrate that none of these single middle-aged women had a close relative still alive, and thus ask permission to use their actual names in print and dispense with anonymity. Second, given that there's nobody to ask about their pasts, documentary research is essential to establish the basic facts of their life histories. This is important when a diarist was childless, outlived other relations, and said little in her own writing about her background. To do justice to these fine writers and their times, one must turn to the tools and techniques of a more modern era. Now Bob will say a little bit more about our work.
So I'll start by saying a few general things about diaries. First, diaries, I think, are and always have been at risk, and for two main reasons. First, they are at risk of being trashed. They often fail to survive the ravages of time, such as uncaring airs, the dustman, mold, or fire, even the diarist, him or herself, who, for example, might look back on youthful outpourings with embarrassment and resolve to liquidate them. Or he or she might regret harsh words written about family members and decide to get rid of them. We learned from Kathleen Tipper, whose MO diary Patricia has mentioned, that for a while she'd kept her own copy of this diary, but at some point decided it was boring and of no interest and threw it out. The only copy then that survived is in this building. There have been many instances of people who, towards the ends of their lives, gathering together their private papers and methodically destroying them. Here are a couple of examples of the perils that diaries have faced. We know that the now famous diary from the 1870s of the Victorian clergyman Francis Kilvert was actually boulderized by his widow, who apparently thought some passages in the original diary alarmingly erotic, so she just got rid of them. And later, in 1950, a niece who owned the Kilvert papers decided, with the agreement of other descendants, that she did not like what he had written and burned most of the diary. So the diary that was published in excerpts in the late 1930s, that's all we have. The rest of it was destroyed, a function of private ownership. There's a private diary in the Imperial War Museum that was written by an unmarried woman in her 30s who lived in Putney with her mother. The diarist, Vivian Hall, sometimes wrote of her personal unhappiness and of having no one to love. One day, her mother discovered the usually hidden diary and was so enraged by what she read in it that she tore out and destroyed pages covering roughly 2 years of the war. She just ripped them out like that and presumably threw them into the fire. And there's this literal big gap in the diary. So here then is a key problem for diaries. Those in private hands are always in peril, whether from neglect, indifference, or deliberate malfeasance. Well, this, of course, leads me to emphasize a reason that mass observation was so important. It functioned as a permanent repository for the diaries of its observers, who usually mailed their writing at least monthly to MO headquarters, where it would remain in an institutional setting. And these diaries could not be retrieved. They were no longer the property of their authors. And this certainly inhibited loss and deliberate destruction. As we know, actually, it gave no absolute guarantee of preservation, partly because MO lost much of its organizational continuity after the war, and it is really largely a consequence of happy circumstances that its surviving papers, and some did not survive, were properly archived at the University of Sussex in the mid-1970s. And this, we gather, was thanks to the efforts of various people, notably Asa Briggs and Dorothy Sheridan. A second risk is that diaries will be massaged and cleansed before they are converted into print. For in due course, their authors or their loved ones may decide that certain passages in the diary are too tactless or shameful or cruel or truthful to see the light of day. Well, Mo solved this problem, that there might later be, shall we call it, tampering with the text, by taking full and complete possession of the diaries it received in return for anonymity. Whatever second thoughts a diarist might later have, it wasn't possible to do anything about them. So while a diarist for Mo might, while writing, engage in some self-censorship, he or she could not massage or rewrite or delete indiscretions. The product of the moment of writing, whether written in grief, anger, exhilaration, would be preserved indefinitely. Once written and put in the post, writing for Mo was out of the diarist's hands. And this is one of the most distinguishing features, I think, of the remarkable collection that is in this building. A consequence of this reality is that some Mo diaries include disclosures that would rarely be discovered elsewhere in sources from the 1940s. Consider, for example, what a single woman in her mid-20s living in Croydon wrote in her diary on the 28th of June, 1940, just as German raids were commencing. I quote, "Some beastly cats are howling as I write. I wonder why cats have to be so dismal in their love-making. Which reminds me that I have been preoccupied again this evening with a sex problem as applied to myself. The more I think about marriage, the less cheerful it seems," unquote. And then she goes on to speculate about various alternatives to marriage, a fairly progressive outlook at the time. And she goes on, "But all this theorizing doesn't solve my problem, which is how am I to get my sex impulses satisfied so as to live a full life without having to catch a man and snare him into marriage and settle down to a dreary domestic life," unquote. Now, had these words been written in a private diary and not for Mo, there's surely a very good chance that they would not have survived subsequent actions by the diarist's possible offspring, or her possible husband, or indeed the diarist herself in old age, who would have had reason to erase from the record such candid ruminations from decades before. My second example is more chilling. It's an account of a conversation on a tram in Leeds on the 9th of November 1944, involving three people: the ticket inspector, a commissionaire, and the diarist herself, Eva Kahn. She reported that the other two, and I quote, "agreed that the one and only good thing Hitler has done is to almost annihilate the Jews. Don't agree myself. They've as much right to live as we have. Don't care for them, though, as a race. Agree with the two of them that they all ought to be parked together in a country of their own," unquote. Well, such brutally racist words, some of them endorsing mass murder, were very unlikely to be recalled in any memoir or retained in any diary controlled by the diarist or her family. Poison of this sort would almost certainly be excised before outsiders could learn that it had ever existed. There are, though, people who are likely to have a major influence on the diaries that get published and what these diaries reveal, and that is their editors. Before embarking on these editorial tasks, Patricia and I were only vaguely aware of the impact that editors might have. For a key fact is that most diaries written in the 20th century, particularly by unknown people, can only be published selectively. Some are very long. Others may be repetitious and sometimes tedious, and there is, understandably, a limited audience for such writing. Consequently, editors will commonly have to select what they think is the best and most interesting of the original text and fashion these selections into, they hope, a book that hangs together. We are aware of only two Mo diaries that have been or will be published in their entirety. One of them, Phyllis Walther's Dorset Diary from 1941-42, just happens to be the right length for a book. It's succinct and not repetitive. Phyllis, in her 30s, gave up writing as her second child was about to be born. Had she not been pregnant, Perhaps she would have continued her writing past July 1942 and thus forced the editors of her diary to make selections, but we didn't have to do it. In the case of another diary, Private Dennis Argent, who Patricia has mentioned, because it was published by the Bedfordshire Historical Record Society, we highlighted all his writing that related to Bedfordshire. Had the publisher been, say, the Army Record Society, which it could have been, readers would be turning the pages of quite a different book. In the dozen or so diaries that we've edited or are in the process of editing, we've tended to take a different approach to each diary and respond to the distinctiveness of the text. In a couple of cases, we chose to begin our selections at a moment of public drama, such as the start of the Blitz on the 7th of September 1940. Or perhaps to conclude the selections at a significant moment, such as the major Allied victories in North Africa in November 1942. Sometimes we felt that a diary that begins strongly peters out after a few months or a couple of years, so we draw it to a close when the quality diminishes and summarize the omitted material in an epilogue. This, for example, is what we are now doing with the diary of Annie Holness, a Londoner evacuated to Morecambe in 1940, who wrote daily and sometimes at length from August of 1941 for almost 10 years. We feel that we can select a lot of good material from the first 22 months of this diary, but much less thereafter. So essentially, we're calling a halt to her story in June of 1943, a little less than 2 years after she started, because then we think there's a lull and decline in her writing. Considerations of significance also need to be confronted. It's common for wartime diarists to report the news of the day, but since all this news was censored, and most people's responses to it were not, in our view, at least noteworthy, we've sometimes cut these passages and instead highlighted those in which the diarist writes about his or her first-hand experiences. But other editors might proceed quite differently. Finally, we have even engaged in a little, although I think a very little, outright censorship, occasionally to protect people still alive, perhaps to grant center stage to the better side of a diarist. For example, in our editing of Nella Last, we have routinely downplayed her pettiness and mean-spiritedness, partly because these qualities are rarely associated with her best writing, in our opinion. We think we've presented her and other diarists appropriately, but different editors in different circumstances might come to other conclusions. I think this is just unavoidable in dealing with such material. Just move on to mention a theme that Patricia's touched upon, the gender differences in diary writing. One consequence, we think, of the real-life circumstances of World War II is that disproportionately the best diaries were written by unattached women of all ages, from their early 20s to their early 50s. They were not distracted by young children, and they tended to live in households where the work was done by others, perhaps their mother, occasionally a landlady. Moreover, and this is more speculative, we think that for many of these women, a diary functioned as a sort of best friend, perhaps at times a confidant, at least a source of meaningful activity in extraordinary times. Almost all these women at some time or other indicated enthusiasm for MO's mission and pleasure in making a contribution, partly to better serve future historians. Some of them say that quite explicitly. This was manifestly the case with Olivia Smith, a young London widow. 28, she was a widow, and she never actually says what happened to her husband. This is a kind of oddity of some diaries. You'd think that a 28-year-old who lost her husband be a significant event. She would say something about it. She never does, at least nothing that we've discovered. She explicitly declares in June 1940 her sociological outlook, her desire to keep a record for posterity. Several of the women we've studied don't appear to have been lonely. They had friends, interests, demanding jobs, close family ties. One had a compelling love life. In at least 2 cases, though, probably more, but at least 2, a diary seems to have compensated for things missing. Annie Holness, who worked in the postal services, hated her job, and being evacuated to Morecambe, she felt exiled from her family in Barnet and her pre-war social life. Kathleen Hay, in her later 30s, assisted in her brother-in-law's grocery shop in Dewsbury and lived under the same roof with him, her sister, and their mother. By all accounts, she was seriously cooped up in these circumstances, surrounded by Philistinism, and happy to find an intellectual outlook through her diary. A diary that includes many witty portraits of shop conversation, family debates, and everyday interactions with Yorkshire's working class. Now, to get slightly personal, though perhaps I shouldn't, question: are we as a couple from another country at an advantage or disadvantage in doing this work? Well, we can't be sure, but on the whole, we think the leaning is to the positive side. First, Canadians tend not to appear on the international scene with a lot of ugly baggage, though our current appalling government is trying to alter that. At least we can't be linked to particulars of schooling, class, family, and the like that can signal trouble in Britain. Second, working together does actually have benefits. When we've met family members, Patricia, I think, has done a better job at establishing rapport with several of them. In dealing with 2 of our living diarists, Kathleen Tipper and Dennis Argent, now deceased, I think that approaching them as a couple helped our cause. Indeed, in one case, I doubt that the book would have come off without Patricia's involvement. I think it was necessary for a couple to be there. Also, joint research and writing means that missteps are quickly corrected, perhaps over dinner, and flawed approaches laid to rest before they get traction. Sometimes 2 heads really are better than 1. Kathleen Hay in Dewsbury was deeply involved with wartime rationing, the complexities of which, notably with regard to the marketing of eggs, are so formidable that even our 2 brains still struggle to grasp the pertinent intricacies. Our main deficiency, we think, is that we often stumble upon a good diary that is rooted in a local history about which we are completely ignorant. Until a couple of years ago, we barely knew that Dewsbury existed, and we certainly could not have placed it on a map. But happily, this is a deficiency that can usually be addressed. We take pains to seek advice from knowledgeable local people, such as librarians and archivists, and we always have local specialists read our annotations and commentaries in order that errors can be rectified and oversights detected. A recent reader of our typescript of Kathleen Hay's Dewsbury diary found a number of references in her writing that had Yorkshire implications about which we knew naught. Appropriate fieldwork also is usually instructive. A few days ago, we were shown around the now closed and once magnificent winter gardens in Morecambe, which Annie Holness routinely patronized during the war. Of course, research of this sort is also fun. Finally, I offer a speculative point. It may be that the pinnacle of diary writing was and will remain roughly the second quarter of the 20th century. Before this, the limitations of popular education, especially for women, and pervasive poverty meant that most people lacked the skills, the leisure, and the confidence for regular writing. By contrast, during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the culture of reading and writing was much broader than it had been, and many more people could be active participants in this culture. As for recent decades, the spread of electronic media has, I think, promoted such very transient communications as text messaging and such very public disclosures of the self as blogging. Traditional diary writing today perhaps is most actively pursued as a form of self-psychotherapy, and no doubt is valuable. Indeed, its value is proven. But the kind of detailed, disciplined, and open-ended diary kept by observers in the 1940s is, I think, a thing of the past. The high point of diary writing was the period of some 3 to 4 generations ago, and what was written for MO may be seen as in part, as testimony to this golden age of British diaries. Thank you.